Hello, everyone. Welcome to part one of the lab assignment 7, the loft tower sequence. So to start out, you'll see a file that looks more or less like this. On the left, you'll have these sort of height reference lines that I've put in just for your use. Okay. And if we start, the first one we'll look at is the geometric example. And if you kind of remember, this is the turning torso tower by Santiago Calatrava. Now this is just a sort of visual reference for you to kind of understand what we're trying to do here. But if you look at the first command, it's the polygon 5-sided command. Okay, so let's just type polygon. So polygon, and then you'll see that in the it's a sort of inscribed, inner inscribed circle, right? And so you can actually set, how many number of sides it has here. So you can click on this and then put in, let's say 5 if we're going for a pentagon. Right, so center of inscribed polygon, I'm just going to click here, and you'll see that this is basically a pentagon. Let's set this to 30, which is roughly the same size as what we had before. Okay? All right. So now what I want to do is copy it upwards. And as you can see, we're going to use the loft command, right, to do this. And so we're going to copy vertical and then click on one of these corner points and because we picked the vertical, you'll go into elevator mode. And I'll snap to this, right? These are the sort of height references. Okay, and you can do all of them at once. Okay, so now these are all aligned basically, and as you kind of remember from the turning torso here, well, it's roughly, kind of a warped pentagon rotating around at a slow sort of pace, right? So we're going to try to replicate that, at least schematically, not necessarily literally, right? So you see the plan, how it rotates. So what we're going to do is that if you think of these as the sort of lofting curves that your surfaces are going to pass through, then the first one, let's say, is fixed at this sort of angle. And so we're going to take the rest of these, right, and then basically slowly rotate them. I'm going to basically select all three of these together and click on the blue arc on your gizmo, on your gumball, and say 20 degrees. All right, so these three turn 20 degrees. Then I'm going to hold down Control and deselect the bottom one, right? So I now have just these two. And then turn it another 20 degrees, and then just select the top one, and then give it another 20 degrees. So now there's a sort of slow progression. Now let's see what happens when we loft this. Okay, so right now you'll see that the loft command, when I select all these together, it automatically sort of sequences it for me. And if I right click to finish it, I'll get the loft options. You don't have to play with these right now, but just say okay. And that's roughly what you'll get, right? And so basically by kind of changing how many degrees you turn, you can sort of change the rotation rate, right? So this is roughly what you would get if you did a 20-degree turn at every sort of single interval. Okay, so that's pretty fair and simple. Now you'll see the last one here is called record history, and this is just something I want to use to kind of demonstrate. So I'm going to copy out these guys to the right, let's say 100. Okay, now there's two things I want to point out. The loft command, you can run it first and then select the curves. But if you do it this way, it will actually remember the order in which you select the curve. So if I click this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, you'll see that the loft will actually go in the sequence that I gave it, and it will actually try to do something really weird like this, right? It will actually try to loft itself through and connect everything into a single surface in the sequence that I gave it. And so if I made it something looser or straight, but it'll sort of double on itself, and that's not what you really want. And this will probably be more pronounced if I sort of move things out of the way like this, and you'll see. So I go this one, this one, this one, this one, and you'll see it basically tries to do it in the sequence that you input it, right? And that's, you know, always kind of a disaster. Okay? I mean, there might be situations where you do want to do that, but for the most part, you want your lofts to be sort of straight in sequence. So usually, if your things are arranged in a certain spatial order, like that, you can pre-select them and then run the loft command. Usually it's smart enough to figure that out. Okay, so that's the first thing, that the sequence or how you select things makes a difference in the loft command. The second thing is the record history. This is a sort of interesting feature, and you'll see the record history command, actually the button for it right here, right next to the gumball. So by default, this is actually done as a one-shot command, which means you click it, you run a command, and then it goes off automatically, or it turns itself off automatically. Unless you click this always record history sort of setting, which usually is not a great idea. So let's see what this does. I'll activate it, right? And then select all these all, loft, say OK. And these are, you know, the basic settings. Let's not change anything, and say OK. Right? Now you'll see the record history button turned itself off. Okay. Now look at what happens when I start, let's say, rotating this more. Oh, okay. So now it's, whoops. I'll say you'll see what happens when I accidentally drag the surface itself and not the profile curve. So I have to undo that. So I'll select the curve and use the sort of blue arc again, or try to use it and then turn it again. So this is actually, you'll see this is a more, in some ways, a kind of more intuitive way of sculpting, right? And because basically what Rhino is doing, it's remembering that, okay, this surface is linked to these curves, and however I move or change these curves, you know, in one direction, I'm moving it around, it will basically try to update itself to match what you're trying to do. Okay, so that's actually very helpful sometimes when you're trying to basically trying to pin down a shape, and instead of like moving things around and relofting it and seeing what it does, then relofting and kind of going through that iteration process. This is a more direct feedback loop that just straight away kind of shows you, right? And you'll see I'm sort of manipulating things. Straight away just shows you, you know, what you're getting. Okay. Now, as you saw before, this is sort of saved in a state where the history is active for this object. But if I, for example, accidentally move the surface or the sort of result of that, it will give me this warning, and it will say, oh, I broke the history because these aren't linked to it anymore because I've moved the sort of result object. So if you don't want to do that, and you have to be careful not to do that if you don't, is to undo it, Control Z, and everything should be fine. Okay? Now if you move everything together, it actually does this as well, right? So basically, you know, once you kind of do the history command, you're kind of set to where you are, right? So just sort of be mindful of that. Okay, so that's a really sort of cool function. All right, so let's go to the next one. This is an ellipsoidal example, and we'll take a look at what that is. So that's this, right? The Absolute Towers by the Chinese firm MAD. And you can see, if you kind of scroll down to the plan, it's basically an ellipse, right? An ellipse that's rotating. So let's try to do more or less the same thing. So this is a simple circle, right? The sort of shortcut way to do this is actually just draw the circle and drag it like that, right? So you can just use a normal circle and 30 as well. Or actually, maybe let's make this larger. That's diameter, that's why. So if you do radius, let's do a diameter of, let's say, 60, a little larger. Okay, that might, we'll see, that might be a little too small, regardless. So you can sort of drag it just about fat enough, like something like that, right? Okay, and we'll go through the same process. Copy, oops, copy vertical, and use zoom out, right? And use the elevator mode to kind of snap to these height guidelines. And we'll go through the same process. I don't know, maybe let's do 15. No, not enough. 20. Let's do 20 again. And if it's not enough, we can always change it. Okay. So let's actually do this one with history too, just so we can adjust things a little bit more easily. So I've turned the history on, I'm lofting it, and actually this, you'll see what happens. So for some reason, my surfaces are getting all broken up, right? They're all striated, like spaghetti, which is not great. Generally for like a single surface thing like this, if I explode it like this, just breaks into tiny little pieces, right? I don't like that. So what happened? Let's record history again and run the loft command. So we'll see that in this case, it doesn't actually detect like the sort of vertice of the rotation of your ellipsoid. Okay, so what you need to do is actually at this point, right after you run the loft command, you have to adjust the seams, and you have to click on this little arrow and it'll sort of slide around, right? And you'll see that it actually kind of snaps to the point, the pointy end of these ellipses. So basically you have to guide it a little bit, right? Give it a little help. Say, okay, normal, and there you will have a nice single surface. Now be advised that some of you might have your ISO curves on, so remember to turn it off if you don't want to see more lines. I always have ISO curves off in this, right? If you have them on, then you'll see more. So turn that off, and then you'll be able to see that as a basic single surface. Okay, now because we had done that with history, now we can mess with this a little bit more and say, well, maybe 20 really wasn't enough, so let's just start. Oops. And you have to be careful not to, it's hard to accidentally select it. And just maybe twist things a little bit more so the profile rotates a lot more in plan. Okay, so that's a little bit more like it, right? A little bit closer to the sort of perspectival effect that this gives you. Now this obviously is a lot taller, so it goes through more sort of rotation, more revolution. Ours is a little bit more shorter and stubbier, so it's a little harder to see, but that sort of rotation amount is about right. It's going from one side to the other, right? Okay. Now, if I really wanted to sort of try to get the shape a lot sort of similar, then because I did the record history, obviously, then I can actually just go through these profile curves, right, and just sort of try to stretch them a little bit so they're a little taller, and then maybe just sort of rotate them a little bit more. And it's actually good to kind of look at the seam curve, right, to kind of know how much you're actually sort of torquing or twisting it as it goes. And it'll kind of give you a good judge, right? Good example to look at in terms of judging how much rotation you're putting into it. Okay, so that probably, is a little bit more proportionally similar, right? Although it's a lot taller. Okay? All right. Now the other sort of variation or version of this is basically, using the simple curve. And let's snap to something. Let's do a larger base, let's say 50. Okay. Copy vertical and just snap to something. Let's do a short 1, 2, 3. So copy it 3 times. So it's the same thing. Like I can start out with this, right? Turn my record history on, loft it, say okay, whatever, okay. So it's nice and dandy, okay. And then go in and say, well, maybe I want the base to be even larger, right? So let's we can scale this, right? Maybe proportionally, maybe non-proportionally, just sort of depends. And you can actually sort of very subtly start to actually move this thing around. So it's like let it torque towards one direction. And maybe we'll put this in as numbers, so 1.3 and 1.3, so that remains a circle, right? And that's sort of skewed. Let's make this slimmer, skinnier, and slimmer. Right, so you'll see that basically, it's very, very easy to kind of manipulate this sort of surface form that way, very, very intuitively by just sort of manipulating your profile, lofting profile curves. All right? Okay, let's move on to the next one. The freeform example. So this is one where basically you use the control point curve, and you just sketch something. And 1, 2, 3, 4, close. Okay, so something like that. It doesn't really matter. And maybe if you really want to, you can kind of edit it a little bit after the fact. So I'm gonna sort of spread out actually these control points a little so they don't all bunch together in the same place. Okay, you can drag it a little bit. All right, now you'll see one of the things I selected them all, right? It tells me I have 12 curve points basically in this whole sort of series, right? Now one of the tricks really is that you want to actually try to keep that sort of consistent, right? You don't want things to be the number of control points on this to go all over the place. You see if I run the rebuild command on this as well, it will tell me how many control points I have in 12. So it depends. Some people, one way to start is like to start with this and then maybe just like copy it vertical, right, a couple of times. So 1, 2, 3, right? And then, you can go in, use the F10 key to kind of turn on and sort of edit these down, right? So there's a little bit, basically you're manually modifying each sort of section, right? That's one way. Another way is actually, sometimes which I do use, is to basically sketch in, just like sort of ignore that and sketch in whatever changes you want over this whole thing. So 1, 2, and then maybe I'll do another one like that. Okay, so depending on, okay, this one, let's move vertical to the second layer. This one, move vertical to the top layer. And this one, move vertical to the third layer. Okay, so you'll see that these sort of freeform versions actually work. Rhino 5 is actually pretty good nowadays at interpolating what you want and not giving you too many errors, as long as you don't have any sharp corners. It's getting pretty good at interpolating your intent. But you'll see the isocurve structure is kind of messy, right? Which is normal with a surface like this that has an irregular amount of points in between, because you'll see some of these curves have much less control points than others. If I turn these on, right? This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this only has 8. And this has 12 or 13, right? So when you have a big discrepancy in your sort of lofting profiles like this, then your isocurves on your surface will get really sort of messy because of that. Okay, but at the same time, these are all still things that if you do it while having the record history on, then you can turn on all the edit points for these, right? And still be able to manipulate them, the edit points themselves, right? In the right sort of viewpoint. You can actually, it's almost as if you're digitally sculpting the profiles like that. And, the surface updates. Okay, so escape to get out of edit points mode, right? And one last thing to mention in this video is actually the the history command. You can find it in the Rhino help if you just Google, not Google, but search history. You'll find the history command, and under the history you will find some more description, but also basically commands that history can work with. Most of these are geometrically sort of aligned commands. For example, pipe, for example. These are commands that you can use with history. So, for example, if you want to see this, and if I pipe it, let's say 10, 5. So this is a non-uniform radius pipe. I went from 10 to 5, right? And if I turn on the wireframe just so I can get to these edit points, right? Then you'll see that, oh, actually I didn't have record history on. So turn on record history, pipe, select this curve, start radius, actually let's do 15, 5. And you can actually insert your own radius somewhere like that. If you want to make it fatter, right? So this is actually a sort of a non-uniform pipe, basically. It's a earthworm. So turn on this, right? And you'll see that I can basically, because I enabled history, that this basically will update with the geometry of my curve, right? So, you'll see that the loft is not the only sort of usage scenario for record history. It's up to you to kind of discover what combinations, but some of them can be pretty useful, okay? Just to remember that, okay, well, as soon as you move this out, you get this. It will give you a warning that you're breaking history. Okay? All right, I'll see you in the next video.